Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Information Architecture Institute webinar. Today, we are very excited to feature the U.S. Government Accountability Office. They reached out to us and we've been talking for a little bit about how they use information architecture to inventory different federal government programs. And we thought this was fabulous content to share with all of our members. We're so excited to have you join today. We will be recording today's session, and we hope to have a Q&A at the end. If we don't, for some reason, get to all of your questions, we'll be following up afterwards to collect those and try to address them all for you. We have a terrific team with us today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Brian James, so that he can introduce himself as well as the rest of the team. Thank you so much. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited about this opportunity to talk about our work and really give full kudos to the information architecture community, because we're not information architects ourselves, but we leverage all of your good work and all of the knowledge that's been produced over the years, and we want to share how we've adapted that to this particular challenge or issue we're dealing with. So to do quick introductions, my name is Brian James. I'm an assistant director with the Government Accountability Office. I work out of our Atlanta field office, and I work on a range of issues. A lot of my background has been in the area of taxation, particularly international taxation and tax policy. But at GAO, we are generally generalists. We do a lot of work across a lot of issue areas, which I'll talk about more, because I imagine many folks aren't really familiar with GAO and our mission and the work that we do. I'll turn it now to my colleague Molly.
Hi, my name is Molly Lester, and I am also with GAO, and I am out of our Seattle field office. This was a bit of a special team because we drew staff from a variety of teams. So I am with our physical infrastructure team, which does transportation work, and I have largely done aviation related work until now. And I will pass it off to Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Service, and I am in GAO's headquarters office, and I work with our Homeland Security and Justice issues. And so lately I've been doing quite a bit of justice work. I've looked at ATF firearms information and how that's stored. And I've also reviewed DOJ systems that contain missing persons information. And so I've been focusing lately in that area, and it was nice to work with my colleagues that have other areas, because similar to information architecture, this project really brought together a number of different specialties. And I'll allow Drew now to introduce himself.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, I'm Drew Nelson. I'm a senior analyst in GAO's Chicago field office, and I'm on our education, workforce, and income security team. And in the past, I've done research on what the federal government does across agencies in specific areas, such as programs benefiting Alaska Natives and federal programs to improve teacher quality. And through that work, I saw how an inventory could help people understand the federal efforts in areas that were most important to them. So I was really excited to join this team and think about possible ways to build an inventory across all federal programs. So Brian, you can talk a little bit more about that effort.
Great, thank you. So to talk a bit more about GAO, we're a congressional watchdog agency. We work in the legislative branch directly for Congress. And our job is to provide nonpartisan advice, objective advice to the Congress to help improve government function. We have been around for a very long time. We started off as an accounting agency, specifically on accounting, but actually the vast majority of the work that we do is more along the lines of performance evaluation. And that's along the lines of what we're going to talk about today, is helping the government work more effectively, not be the quote bean counters that sometimes people think that we are. We certainly have folks who do that very important work, but our mission is much broader. We, again, work for Congress, and they either request the work of us or they mandate it in public law for us to look at particular issues. because we do work for the Congress and we help them with oversight. Anywhere that federal money is spent, we generally have jurisdiction to go in and evaluate it. So as you heard from my colleagues, we have a wide breadth of work and experience just amongst ourselves. But our agency, which is a mid-sized agency, about 3,000 employees, we look at pretty much everything: defense issues, homeland security issues, as I mentioned, tax issues, and aviation, transportation, education, healthcare, DOD healthcare, VA healthcare. Really runs the gamut, and we try to basically get the government to work as effectively and efficiently as possible. We think a program inventory will help support that, which we'll talk about some more. So to give a little context, before we jump into what we did, the work that we did, the federal government's been attempting to develop a federal program inventory for many, many years, many different attempts. Here we highlight just a few that were fairly recent. One was back in '98. There was a mandate that agencies look at the activities that they do that are, quote, not inherently governmental, and much of that was focused on commercial activities that could potentially be outsourced or to the private sector, or that just generally are intended for the private sector. That effort, we evaluated it and found that essentially it's the same issues we've run into every single time, which is there's a lack of consistency in terms of what people were defining or agencies were defining as programs, and made the information pretty much unusable. Then back in 1993, the Government Performance and Results Act was passed, which actually has done quite a lot to help improve government oversight and accountability. It enforced or required agencies to develop strategic plans, to develop goals, performance goals, and to just have a better handle of what their role is and mission is in the various areas that agencies work. There certainly have been many positive results out of that, but there has not been a comprehensive federal inventory that's been able to be developed from that effort. And then in the 2000s, during the Bush administration, there was a major initiative to develop the Program Assessment Rating Tool. Again, this was very helpful in some ways in providing oversight, but in our analysis, it was the same issue, that there was a lack of consistency in terms of what was being identified as programs. It certainly was not comprehensive. The evaluations and the information that was gathered within each of the areas, or the data elements that were provided, were inconsistent, which created a lot of challenges and issues to the objectivity of the analysis and ultimately the usability of that information. That brings us to more recent time. The GPRA Modernization Act, which was an effort to modernize what I mentioned before, the efforts to develop better performance information at agencies. It made a number of changes. The one that's critical to our discussion today is that they required the agencies to develop an inventory of federal programs. And OMB led that effort. OMB is the Office of Management and Budget. They're the executive branch agency that sort of sits over all of the executive branch government, executive branch agencies, provides guidance and initiatives and priorities for agencies, as well as helping develop the budget requests for those agencies each year that Congress reviews in their appropriations decisions. So the Modernization Act required that the agencies develop an inventory of programs, and they're supposed to describe the programs, describe how they aggregate or disaggregate them, how they're combined or pulled together, whatever decisions are made, provide budget information, and ultimately be useful in providing a coherent picture of all federal programs. Additionally, as the oversight agency that we are, they asked GAO to review the implementation of this Modernization Act, including the efforts to develop the inventory. So our colleagues, different mission or engagement team, project team, looked at the initial inventory that the Office of Management and Budget developed. It was considered a pilot at the time. They only took the 24 biggest agencies, the ones that you would expect, like Department of Homeland Security and others. So it wasn't a comprehensive effort, but it was an initial effort to get really the biggest players in federal government. You look at the 24 largest agencies. And as I said before, there's a consistent theme with these past efforts. There was a lack of consistency in the way that programs were being identified. As this figure here shows, Some agencies use budget information, at least in part or in whole, to identify programs. Others looked at their customers, what their outcomes or outputs were, and maybe even the organizational structure to find the decisions they made in identifying programs. As you might imagine, that creates significant inconsistency, both in terms of the scope or scale of something they would consider to be a program, and the level of detail that's provided, and just the amount of information that was provided. Some agencies captured a large portion of what they did or involved in, although not in a very detailed way, and others were at such a high level that they would break down their programs into 4 or 5 broad buckets or something like that, in which really there's a lot more going on beneath the surface of these broad areas that they tended to describe as programs. So with that overview, I'll turn it over to my colleague Drew, who will talk a little bit more about our work and what we did.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And the slide that just came up, slide 6, in GAO speak, the word criteria refers to sort of a standard of what should be. And Brian noted a few aspects of that with the GPRA requirements for an inventory that would present a coherent picture of all federal programs. And I just kind of want to pause here just to emphasize that's a high bar for an enormous task, presenting a coherent picture of all federal programs. And GAO unpacked that a bit with criteria in our report on that initial OMB inventory effort. In that report, we noted that for an inventory to be useful, it would need to be accurate, complete, and consistent, among other things. And as you can imagine, that's not an easy thing to do. So as an example, in that prior report, we saw how difficult it was to consistently identify programs that helped with STEM education, focusing on science, technology, engineering, and math. And we found that while some of those programs were identified in that first inventory, those weren't necessarily all the programs that could have been included. And so that leads to a central question of a program inventory, which of course is, what's the definition of a program? So on slide 7, we talk about, or we refer to GAO's glossary of terms used in the federal budget process. And that defines programs generally, as you can see there, as an organized set of activities directed toward a common purpose or goal that an agency does to carry out its responsibilities. And even though that's pretty squishy, it's pretty squishy for a good reason. Programs can relate to a lot of different aspects of an agency's mission or functions or activities. So in that sense, it's good to have that flexibility. One downside to it, though, is that when it comes to compiling this inventory of federal programs, there might be a lot of different ways for an agency to identify just what those programs are, like we saw with those STEM education programs. And so it would be very difficult, maybe even impossible, for agencies to always do that the same way. And it would be tough to get to meet that criteria of a coherent picture of all federal programs in a way that's complete and consistent and would allow that kind of comparability across the entire federal government. Then on slide 8, making this challenge even more daunting is the fact that agencies use terms in different ways to describe their programs and activities. And we put a word cloud on here on the slide to give you some sense of the words used to describe agency programs. And this cloud was created using the program names from the 2016 federal budget. And the cloud kind of reflects some of what Brian showed earlier regarding the discretion agencies had in identifying their programs for the first inventory. For example, the agencies could use a budget approach, and you can see the words expenses and salaries in there, or agencies could use an organizational structure approach. It's kind of like the worst I Spy game I could play with my kids. I can see office administration and facilities in there. But don't worry, I'm not going to try that one out. Even some of the most obvious words on there, like programs, that's the biggest one, that word isn't used consistently within an agency, let alone across agencies. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but for now, know that sometimes agencies can't even use words consistently. They don't have that ability under statute because there are different definitions set in different statutes. And that's the case actually with the word rural. which can mean different populations under different laws. And then another challenge is that for an inventory, agencies need to decide how much to roll up what they do into what they might call a program, how much they aggregate their activities and sort of the umbrella term of program, and then how they relate to each other. And so those are kind of the front-end challenges of identifying programs and relationships among them. And Molly, you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges faced with getting information specifically about those programs.
Right, and certainly once you've cleared that very, very high bar of what is a program and how should it be included within the inventory, it's the next large task then is to collect information about it. And that's hard both because you have to decide then what to collect, and then it has to be consistent and done across all of the various programs and all of the various agencies. And so the work that GAO did to look at the first attempt that OMB did found, first of all, that none of the 24 agencies included even the basic information that was required, so budget and performance. And as Drew said, to some extent that's very hard. So it's not completely a function of they didn't try. It's that some of those things are very hard to track down, particularly if your understanding of what a program is various. And then certainly from our work and from some other things which we'll talk a bit about more, the budget and performance is just the bare minimum of what you would probably want to include. And so we found that they didn't include information about what programs did, and based on some of the work that we've done, they didn't include tax expenditures, which with the news now, tax expenditures are kind of a big deal. So those are the write-off you take for your home mortgage, for example. So that's not a cost in terms of an outlay for the federal government, but it does reflect revenue that could be collected that is not. And so that, in our view, and under GPRA, should be included as a program as well. And then lastly, once you collect these things for the programs you found, you need then to present it in a way that's useful. And the first inventory is still online now, and it is 24 separate PDF documents. And so you have to download them, you have to find them, you'd have to do a search for certain words, you'd have to look for certain programs or read through the whole thing. There's not a capacity to aggregate and compare within one agency, much less across them. So I think that pretty much sums up the big challenges that we thought we might address, which brings us to this job. And for us, this is not the type of thing that we typically do at GAO. This is very much a think piece, in part because OMB then came to us and said, well, how could we fix this? What could we possibly do to do a good job next time? You said that our work was not consistent and not comparable, so what could we do instead? And so we began this job to look at, in a much more philosophical way, how could information architecture be leveraged to help provide a step-by-step process, or at least a framework that OMB could potentially use as they move to try and satisfy this requirement again. So we had two big steps, which include, of course, a lot of sub-steps, but the two big things are both here. One is to look at the principles and practices of information architecture itself, to develop this potential framework. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we tested some pieces of that application. We didn't look at 24 agencies. We didn't identify 1,500 programs, certainly. But we did test pieces in how you could use IA to identify programs and collect and organize program information. So now I'll move it on to Michelle.
Great. So, again, there's several challenges that exist with this effort. And when we started this engagement, we wanted to focus on where is there a path forward? How can we move forward with this effort to help OMB determine steps to inventory information about federal programs? And so we went out to see what was available in the field as best practices. So we've identified some IA materials that were very useful. We met with information architecture authors and presenters. We reviewed information and went through to see where there was commonality with steps forward for federal websites. And so this report lays out one potential way to organize information that we think can be useful to developing the inventory. And so something that information architecture really emphasizes that we believe is critical to having this effort be successful is establishing that use and purpose right up front. So knowing what the inventory will be used for, that way you can design something that will actually be useful. And so you'll see throughout the process, the steps refer back to this concept of, okay, now check with the user, check to see, is this what you're trying to achieve? Will someone use this information rather than having it sort of sit out in cyberspace? So after you establish that initial use, look through and identify terms and concepts that are important, that are coming up over and over again, and prioritize your efforts to collect information related to those concepts and terms. Once you have those, go through and build relationships between them, so that way there's not just a blob of information. Give it some structure, and that way the information can be put into a more useful format. Once you've formatted the information, go back to your potential users and ask if the relationships and the terms together make sense. See that there is some usefulness and refine based on their feedback. Once that process occurs, go into a virtual environment and add in additional features such as sorting, searching, and filtering that can allow people to find that information. We talked earlier about having the ability to aggregate and disaggregate program information, and that is a concept that aligns with GPRA, but also aligns with information architecture principles. Once that happens, go back and again validate and make sure that the users find this interactive system useful. Refine and tweak it to make sure that you have something that meets their needs and ultimately will provide useful information that's consistent across the government to the end user. Finally, we think that it's important to emphasize this is not a one-and-done effort. This is something that will need to be continually reviewed and updated, especially as policies change and times change, to make sure that the information in the inventory stays relevant. So creating that governance structure and plan will help to ensure this is a useful effort moving forward and not a stagnant piece of information. So you can go on to the next slide, Brian. So we identified 3 key concepts that we ended up applying through our testing of information architecture. So the first one is represented there with a lock, and that's the concept of controlled vocabulary. And this concept goes back to helping to put some bounds around terms that can be used. This will ensure that terms are used in a consistent manner. So when you see a term in the inventory, you know what it's referring to. As Drew said, there are some challenges there with terms like rural that are defined in statute, but it's important to have some bounds around the terms that are used so users understand what those terms mean. We also looked at a faceted approach, which is represented there by a diamond. That idea is consistent with the idea of, finding information about programs that are present, that will be useful, that are different lenses or views of a program, and we'll get into that a little bit further in our application. There's also the term taxonomy, and I'm sure this is something that you're familiar with as well, which is just that organizational principle. And again, this taxonomy facilitates the aggregation or disaggregation of program information. And so if you need to sort or filter or find in a broad scale things that could be tagged with certain information in application, such as early childhood learning, you can find all of the programs that have that certain piece of information, or you can disaggregate to find information that is specific to a singular program that you need more information on. So Drew is going to talk a little bit more about how we applied the controlled vocabulary.
Thanks, Michelle. So building on that first bullet from the last slide on how a controlled vocabulary might be needed to identify programs consistently, we actually sort of tested this out. We used budget documentation to test how well those documents could identify programs. We just wanted to see how the program lists we developed with those documents could measure up against the criteria we mentioned earlier, such as completeness and comparability. And we tested the budget documents at 3 agencies. Like Molly said, it wasn't we couldn't test it against the whole federal government and all of the programs. So we chose 3: the Department of Education, Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, and the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. We chose those agencies to get a range of the different ways agencies had completed their initial inventories, and also a range of agency structures. So in going through those budget documents, we found that agencies used terms like program and then some other organizing concepts like a broader program area or a more specific program activity. They use those in different ways, not just across agencies, but actually within the same agency and actually within the same budget document. So for example, USAID used the word program to describe efforts at really broad regional levels, like a Southern African energy program, or at a country-specific level. And DHS sometimes used the terms program and program area interchangeably to refer to the same effort. And I want to be really clear, we're not criticizing these agencies, the variations in agency structure, history, mission, that kind of thing. They can lead to these differences. It's just the fact that how agencies use these organizing concepts varies, and that simply shows that identifying programs presents significant challenges for an inventory that's supposed to yield that coherent picture of federal programs. And so this testing that we did really just demonstrated the need for a controlled vocabulary. Even with a controlled vocabulary, though, there are still going to be some differences across agencies. They've got flexibility in deciding what activities constitute a program, which a couple of us have touched on earlier. And so, Brian, yeah, going to that next slide, slide 14, how broadly and narrowly agencies roll up these activities and call them a program definitely can affect how useful that inventory is. So, for example, if an agency groups a lot of activities under a small number of program names, that could limit the transparency over what all is being done within that program. And it also could not hide, but not give the kind of transparency that one would hope for regarding related costs. On the other hand, if an agency groups activities really narrowly, that could yield some greater transparency on those costs, for example, for each of those activities. But it also could make it more difficult for agencies to identify and maintain information about each of those programs. So there's a bit of a balance there between sort of using a narrower approach or a broader approach, and really is going to be up to each agency to do that, to make those decisions. And then also because agencies and their structures differ, it'd be helpful for them to clearly illustrate the relationships between those activities, which I think Michelle touched on. And we think that decision rules could help with that. That could help different users of the inventory understand these things a little bit better, since they're going to be looking to use the inventory in different ways, and the rules can help with that understanding. And then decision rules can also help agencies be a bit more transparent with maybe somewhat more opaque funding streams that really aren't tied to specific programs, like general administration. And each of the three agencies that we looked at did have these kinds of expenses. So for example, education had what they called program administration program, and that accounted for over $400 million in 2015 obligations for education, and it funded actually close to half of the agency's roughly 4,000 full-time employees. So it's not these small programs that are a little bit nebulous. Sometimes they're pretty big programs that just don't have the kind of clarity that one would hope for within the context of an inventory. So hopefully you can see how a controlled vocabulary and these decision rules can help identify programs, but you can also understand that it is still challenging to do that. So our report that we put together, hopefully with that information architecture approach, is a way to actually de-emphasize that program unit of analysis. It's still important, but there's a more specific level of information, what we're calling facets, that can help paint that coherent, comparable picture. And actually, Molly can talk a little bit about those facets.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so once you have your list of things that are programs or program-like, then it's important to think about what it would be that you would collect and include in the inventory about those programs. And we took a bit of a different approach here in terms of trying to enter into this piece somewhat apart from the discussion about what is a program. So instead of trying to look at, so what are the programs and what information is available about them, we looked instead to what information would you want to have inside your inventory. Somewhat separate from could you get that for all of the programs you identify. And so certainly there are things that have to be there. So budget and performance information is required. We think that tax expenditures are as well. But beyond that, we went out and looked at our own work and work that is done by states and other stakeholders and talk to our requesters on the Hill about what they'd like to see. And one thing that was very, very strong was that they want to know what programs actually do and whom they serve and what are the main services or activities that they're engaged in. And that certainly matches our experience from the work that we do. GAO does a lot of lists to assess programs that do specific things like STEM, like providing transportation to disadvantaged populations and things like that. And most of those lists are based on what does the program do. And so they are then cross-agency lists. So those things certainly matched what we might expect to find, but that's a new area to include. Brian, you can move along. So we went out to test this faceted approach. So we built this giant spreadsheet, which would not be what the whole federal government would want to do in one Excel spreadsheet necessarily, but we did attempt to collect this type of information for more than 20 programs in at least 8 federal agencies, and the boxes were all there, and we tried to fill those in as best we could. And so those facets were drill downs in these main areas here. So what is the name of the program? What is the legal authorization for it? What's its history? What type of program is it, and things like that describe programs. What's its budget for at least 3 years? What is available that it's performance in terms of goals and there are various kinds of ways to measure that. So CAP goals and specific program objectives and things like that. What does it do? Whom does it serve? And then what are some corollary pieces of information about it? We found that it was much easier to collect this information for programs where the name was in the documents that we were trying to search. And that might sound very obvious, but it comes up in terms of like budgets and things like that, or performance plans that may not drill down to the level of what we would think of as an individual program. So for those things that weren't listed by name, it became much more complex to track down those pieces of information. We presume that it would be much simpler for agencies to do that themselves, because they should all know what the budgets are and what those pieces of information are for their own programs at least. So Brian, you can move on, and I think we throw to Michelle.
Great, thanks. So after doing the work that Drew and Molly described, we came together and identified 6 early education and child care programs from prior GAO work. So we put together the list of the 6 programs with those pieces of information that Molly referenced. And we decided that it was important, as we've mentioned throughout, to go back and go to the user and see, would this information help you? Is this information relevant to your needs. Like, will you actually use this information in your work, and how would you use it? So we looked for commonalities across programs, and we had programs that were in, different departments, so that way it wasn't just DHS or USAID or education. It was a variety of departments. We organized this information in Protégé, which is an open source software site that is hosted by Stanford University, and we created a structure with the information in that program. We also created the program-specific summaries for individual programs, so that way the congressional staffers that we met with could see what some potential information you could gather from a program inventory would result in. And so, Brian, if you can go to the next slide. You can see here, it's a little bit small, but some of the key pieces of information and categories that we identified. So there's a program description category that gives some history and talks about the purpose of the program. There's more structural information, such as what agency is the program in, what type of program is it, what's the community of jurisdiction. If there's related programs, that's a piece of information that a number of clients felt would be important. There's also the budget information, so one could find historical funding information on a specific program. In addition, there's performance information, which Molly and Brian both referenced is required by GPRA, so that is a key piece of information to have. And finally, one piece of information that we really did find was critical to include was this program operations category. So what is the program objectives? Who are the intended beneficiaries? And some of those more basic functional questions could be answered in this particular facet. So if you go to the next slide, we can talk about some of the responses. So we went up to the clients with the different committees. So we looked at the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and the House Committee on Education and Workforce. And we asked them, would this be helpful? How would you use this information? And they provided us with several potential uses. And really, the time saving, if you think about looking for programs that are in a particular area that are related, but perhaps in a different department or agency that the congressional staff might not be familiar with, it can take a lot of time to track all of that down, and a lot of phone calls, and even identifying places where there's a lack of information. So let's say an agency is unable to fill out all of these facets. That alone is useful information in sort of knowing what the unknowns are, in addition to just providing information to inform a number of congressional decisions. We also got a lot of feedback that it would be helpful to include historical data about programs. So if, for instance, a program ended or funding ended for a program, maintaining that log of, okay, what have we done in the past? How has that worked out? And allowing for that historical data to be preserved would provide useful information going forward, so that way we can learn from past experiences with programs. And I think Brian is going to talk about the future of IA.
So we've talked a lot about sort of the aspects of what we think the inventory could include following an information architecture approach. This slide basically, as we talked about already, to be able to do searches by different facets. And it's kind of hard to present something that really is a dynamic capability in a static environment like this. But really what this figure is intended to show is that for all of those, any of those facets that Michelle just talked about, such as which agency, what the budget was, what the strategic goal is, and then most importantly, perhaps what are the actual activities provided. So in this case, early learning or child care services, to put that in sort of an interface in which you can do a search for all earlier child care services programs and and it spits out a list of programs that all provide those services: Child Care Development Fund, Family and Child Education, Promise Neighborhoods, Literacy Development Grant, who the agency is, what the obligations are, what the spending is, and it sort of gives you a snapshot of everything that may be contributing to that particular operation and activity. And we think this was, it's quite common, I guess, in the private sector when you think about the shopping websites and so on. it certainly is not a capability that is pervasive in the federal government when it comes to the full breadth of the work that the federal government and the spending that the federal government does. And one thing that we care a lot about at GAO is duplication, overlap, and fragmentation. For years, about 7 years now, we've put out an annual report to look at opportunities to manage these issues. I won't get into the details here, but essentially when these things happen and it's either unnecessary or could be better managed, there are possibilities for greater efficiencies and effectiveness, which can often translate into cost savings. And in our work over the years, we've identified tens of billions of dollars in opportunities to decrease these burdens. Much of the work that we've done to identify duplication, overlap, and fragmentation has been very labor intensive. We have to basically dig through reams and reams of documents or files and try to tease out where there are programs that provide similar services. As Drew mentioned earlier, in the STEM education area, we identified, I think, 50 or more potential programs that provide STEM type education. If there was a place to organize this information more effectively, it might make it easier to identify these particular issues and then make it easier to address them, as opposed to the very laborious sort of digging that we currently have to do at GAO. And so we think there are quite a lot of benefits. And so even though we didn't make a recommendation in this particular report, we did have a companion report that looked at the implementation of the GPRA Modernization Act overall. And within that work, they basically suggested that OMB continue to take strides to implement the inventory. They have not done so yet. At our last status update in October of this year, they did indicate that they were going to try to use some existing taxonomies or data elements in some of the spending areas that they have. There's an initiative ongoing to create better and more consistent reporting on federal spending data, and we encouraged them, and they agreed that they could probably leverage that to actually help develop a potential taxonomy and ultimately organize that spending information at a programmatic level, as opposed to more of an appropriation account level, which is not always associated with specific programs. And that's our presentation. We would love to use the rest of our time to address questions. What I am going to do is we did receive a series of questions over the, or ahead of time. I apologize. I can't do two things at once. And I will go through those. We'll go through those quickly. And then I believe we did get some Q&As pop up during the session, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can. Certainly encourage you to continue adding questions, and if we can't get to them today, we'll certainly try to find a way to address them for you going forward. So one question received is, how is GAO planning to get buy-in from their communities and stakeholders to implement the recommendations that we made? So as part of our effort, as we discussed, we did quite a lot of work to get input from stakeholders. So we spoke with Congress, we obviously spoke with current OMB officials, we also spoke with prior OMB and Treasury and other government officials who had been involved with developing the inventory prior. All of them really provided good feedback, and we had overwhelmingly positive input, or positive feedback. A lot of people agreed that this was exactly the right kind of approach to take to help deal with those issues of consistency we identified before. And OMB in particular said that this had helped them sort of rethink and reframe their potential approach, and we view that as a positive. And then in terms of continuing to have buy-in, we do, as part of our recommendation follow-up process, at least once a year, check in with agencies to see what the status is of their efforts and report that publicly on our website. And as we talked about before, the inventory is a mandate, it is required by the Congress, and our assumption is that the oversight staff will continue to monitor the progress of the effort, and certainly speak with the agencies and with OMB if progress is not being made. Our next question is, will you be creating a master lexicon and require other agencies to follow these definitions? How will you deal with semantic requirements, and will you penalize the use of legacy terms? So to be clear, GAO, we are an audit agency and we make recommendations. So ultimately, it is the executive branch's responsibility to implement whatever inventory effort they develop. it's our opinion that information architecture is a valid approach here. And that would, as we talked about, could involve developing a controlled vocabulary, and we've laid out the benefits there. But to the extent possible that they do that, that's sort of their call. We will say, though, if they do develop another inventory and we still see that because they did not use consistent terms, and it had a detrimental effect on the accuracy, reliability, or the validity of the information, certainly that could be a potential finding in our evaluation, and we might then point that out and say in future efforts to develop the inventory, there should be more consistency and maybe further emphasize how a controlled vocabulary might help with that. Another question we got was, do you have an idea of the return on investment around this initiative? And that's an excellent question, and one actually that OMB asked us as well. The bottom line is that was not within the scope of the work for what we did, and mainly because our framework, as you saw, is pretty high level and broad. It allows for what we think is quite a lot of flexibility and adaptation, given the circumstances that the agencies may face in terms of resources and other constraints. And we didn't think it was appropriate for us to make any significant assumptions about what would be done and what should not be done. In order to really do a good, effective return on investment analysis, you really need to make some of those decisions or make those assumptions. So, we didn't do that. We do believe, though, however, that there is significant potential benefits here that could be realized if we took what we have now, which is a very scattered, inconsistent set of information about programs or lack of about programs, and try to make them more consistent, centralize them to deal with the issues of duplication, overlap, and fragmentation that we discussed. Certainly provides more transparency over government, so helps with oversight. And then even the budgeting process itself, it's very laborious. It takes a lot of time and effort. All the agencies approach it in kind of different ways. Their structures are different. So if this should ever replace sort of the current budgeting practices with the unit of analysis that's used to make budgeting decisions, there's really a lot of potential opportunities for increased efficiencies. I have a couple more questions. One was, how might we capture and record civil discourse conversations accurately in the service of decision making? So this question was a little broad and vague, I have to admit, and I wasn't exactly sure how it applied to this context. But within this context, how I will try to answer is to refer to what I said before, which is that in capturing and recording conversations accurately in decision making within the context of the inventory, we think it's critical. As we point out in our framework, the key to much of this is making sure you engage with stakeholders early and often and throughout the process of developing the inventory. And without their buy-in, without their input, you ultimately don't develop something that's going to meet their needs. And so there will need to be a good systematic process for addressing that. And then we have one more question that we received ahead of time, and then I'll try my best to get to your other ones. I'll actually turn to my colleague, Michelle, for this one. This is a pretty specific one into the criminal background check system, and she is our resident Homeland Security participant, so we'll let her try to field that one. Go ahead, Michelle.
Right, thanks. So the question was specific to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, also known as NICS. And so this question focused really on sharing that information with individuals that might potentially help to monitor people who would be at risk of potentially, committing crimes that could have a major negative impact. And so NICS, unfortunately, we haven't reviewed that system recently for the potential to share the information with the public, but we have reviewed the system recently in 2016 to look at individuals and how they're denied firearms. So GAO reviewed the system to evaluate the extent to which checks on domestic violence records are completed before firearm transfers can take place. And so to give you some context, under federal law, firearm dealers may transfer firearms to an individual if the FBI has not made a proceed or denial determination within 3 business days. So it's critical for these NICS checks to be completed in a timely manner. We found that most NICS checks involving domestic violence records are completed before the firearm transfers take place. However, since 2006, there have been 6,700 firearms that were transferred to prohibited individuals. So those transfers should not have taken place. As a result of this analysis, we recommended that FBI monitor the timeliness of NICS checks to assist DOJ entities in establishing priorities for improving timeliness of checks. So targeting their resources to the checks that seem to take longer. And so we assess the system for that specific purpose, but we'll continue to move forward in looking at DOJ justice systems in the future as well. So I hope that gave some context to the question. I'm not sure if we have time for many more.
You know, hey everybody, this is Dan Klein. We're out of time, but I want to thank our friends from the GAO so much for sharing this amazing work that they've done with us. There were many questions that we did not get to. There is a recording of this webinar that we will distribute as soon as it gets done processing on the machine it's recording on. And GAO folks, would you be willing to receive some of these questions for offline interaction with some of our members? I saw that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is Brian. So we have the list here. I don't know if I can capture these. If you could, just find a way to get these to us, and we'll be happy to provide some brief responses in writing. And maybe it could be in addition to the, I don't know exactly how you host your videos or where you could do it, but somewhere where we could place them where anybody could review the questions, almost like a FAQ kind of thing, and answer them. But yeah, absolutely. And please feel free to continue to send more if you're interested or have some that pop up after the fact. We really appreciate this opportunity. One thing I want to mention just really quick on all this is that, you know, for you all as information architects, there's some opportunities here. OMB is expected to develop an inventory. We're not the experts. We're not going to do it for them. And there's probably not a lot of people in the agencies that have this expertise, although I'm sure there are some. So certainly keep an eye out in the government space, and maybe you'll see some requests for proposals at some point, or some other outreach to get information architects involved to help with this really important effort.
Yeah, Brian, if that RFP ever gets issued, we would love to distribute it to our members. That would be fantastic.
And I did include the link to our report itself in the chat box. So feel free to use that, or do a little search. It's not hard to find us. So there's more information there as well about the work that we did and what we found and how.
You guys are amazing. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Brian. Sam and Laura, my colleagues who kicked off this call. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, thank you to Logic Department, a New York-based information architecture and content strategy consultancy who provided the technology for our call today. So